Good Saturday morning, everyone. Today on Perspectives, we talk with two local scientists about the evidence and the causes of climate change. According to NASA, our world is getting warmer, and the problem is, quote, extremely likely to be attributed to human activity. Of concern to local scientists is a negative effect of global warming can have on the Gulf Coast itself. Now, according to Dr. Steven Schultz, rising sea levels are already a problem in Florida, Alabama, and Louisiana. But he says that the situation will only get worse. Schultz adds that when you consider the potential for stronger hurricanes in a warmer world, adapting to climate change will come at a significant cost. Well, Dr. Schultz is with the University of South Alabama's Department of Earth Sciences. He's also an associate professor of geography and is South Alabama's GIS program coordinator. Also joining us this morning is Dr. Kenneth Heck, Jr. He is an emeritus faculty member and senior marine scientist with the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and a professor at the University of South Alabama as well. And Dr. Heck tells us that the kinds of tropical plants and animals that are now in the northern Gulf of Mexico and the changing ecology of coastal Alabama waters are all due to climate change. So stay tuned this morning for a fascinating discussion and how the farm economy of the town of Alberta in Baldwin County was affected by those rising temperatures. Perspectives continues after this quick break. Our first guest this morning on Perspectives, Dr. Steven Schultz with the University of South Alabama. And Dr. Schultz is with the Department of Earth Sciences and an associate professor of geography. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You know, one of the things I think I mentioned to you when we first talked was I was prompted by hearing this program. What is the media doing to make this more of a conversation that everyone can join in and talk about, as well as observe some of the things that are happening around us as we talk about climate change this morning? Give us an idea of why that is necessary. Why should we be talking about this?
Well, climate change is something that impacts all of us. Even if it's not something that's immediately obvious, it's something that has pervaded its way pretty much into everyday life for everyday people. It was something that maybe a couple decades ago seemed like an abstraction or just something that's off into the future, but really it's something that's been here the whole time. And as a result, this is something having a show like this, or shows that we're seeing like on the BBC or on other news networks, I think is important, because this basically it's getting the message out. It's bringing the word into people's living rooms, which is something that really has needed to happen for a while, and I'm happy to see that it's happening now.
You know, I love watching National Geographic and other nature programs and those types of things. And we've been seeing in the last several years about the glaciers and the polar ice caps and changes taking place there. How close is that to us, though? I probably would assume there's some things that we can see where we are that have changed over the last 5, 10, 15 years as well.
Well, certainly. And sure, if you see the pictures of, polar bears in precarious positions, it feels like, oh, that's bad, but that's thousands of miles away. And yet, no, something like climate change doesn't just affect Arctic areas. It also affects our area just here in the central Gulf Coast. A big one that I like to always include is what's been going on with peaches here, something that I think that we can all identify with. I myself love some peach cobbler.
Me too.
And a great example is, we're talking maybe about 100 or so years ago, down here on the Gulf Coast, we had a pretty healthy peach industry, and we were growing one variety called Alberta peaches, even got a town named after it over in Baldwin County. Alberta, and the thing is now here we really can't grow Alberta peaches anymore. We used to be able to, because we would hit what we called the chilling requirement during winter. Well, we don't really get that anymore, and it's been like that for a couple of decades. And although they can still get it up in Chilton County, a good 200 miles north of us, well, we can't really do that anymore. We can grow peaches, but we have to grow varieties that can basically thrive through much, much warmer winters than what we used to have even just a couple of decades ago. And that's just something that, that's in your kitchen. That's on your, on the table.
That's very measurable, because I can vouch for the fact of trying to find good peaches locally, and even sometimes now the ones further north aren't like they used to be.
Oh yeah, and we'll probably continue to see that as time goes on in the next couple of decades. And that's just, again, one example of many in our region, and there are, of course, many more examples all around the world. And that's just agriculture right there.
You know, a lot of folks also talk about the coastal areas where water levels are changing. The tides are a little different when things happen, like we maybe see more of the causeway, the water level being higher there under circumstances that used to not be then, but only when certain storms and things came. Talk about how climate change affects the coastal areas.
So definitely a big concern here, sea level rise. We have such a important tourism industry, also the just general heavy industry that goes on around here that are dependent on the bay, dependent on the coastline. And yeah, seeing sea level rise is a concern. And we have seen, of course, sea level rise here over in Mississippi. Of course, Louisiana, famously, there's an example there where the state of Louisiana loses about a football field's worth of land every hour. So with that in mind, in the Gulf Coast, this is just right in our own backyard right there. But closer to home, we are, of course, concerned about sea level rise, what it means, of course, for our coastal communities, especially when we're talking about storms, hurricanes, or severe weather. We're worried about loss of land, and we're also worried about what's going on with real estate values, because insurance becomes much higher when you see this. We've seen this already in places like South Florida, and we expect that it is already happening now. Again, this is just another way to underscore that this is an issue today. It's not a future us problem. It's a problem in the present.
Well, as we monitor the weather in this part of the country, we talk about hurricanes and, of course, tornadoes as well. Are what we're experiencing now a result of the climate change, or just a cyclical type of thing that happens?
So I don't want to make it sound as if climate change is now the cause for literally every single hurricane or literally every single tornado. But the conditions that then can sustain, let's say, a hurricane, or to bring a hurricane, let's say, from a little category 1 up to a 3, I'm sure most of us remember Sally pretty well. The conditions for that to happen are becoming much more frequent than what they used to even just a couple of decades ago. And as ocean temperatures continue to likely rise in the next couple of decades, well, then we should expect to see relatively similar issues. And on top of that, we have more people living here in our region, more than we ever have in the past. And as a result, that also means that it only takes one bad storm to really take a big punch to the gut, and as a result, having potentially more stronger storms means we have more to lose when we finally do get a big one. And Sally was a great example of that, but Mobile County hasn't had a direct hit since Frederick, and that was in '79, and that was quite a while ago.
Yeah, it makes us nervous, and especially after what we saw happen in Panama City a couple of years ago. Just devastating. I lived there for a few years while in the military, and I could not believe what I saw when I went over there. Well, let's talk about, we're talking about it this morning. Let's talk about what can we do as an ordinary citizen, someone who is concerned, that cares about it, and wants to see something done for the better.
Well, one thing that I always get asked if I'm talking to public, and I get asked by students quite a bit, is, what does it matter what we do here in either the Gulf Coast or here in America if we're worried about what's going on in other countries around the world, if they're not doing anything? If China isn't doing anything or India isn't doing anything, why do we have to do anything? And that's a perfectly fair question, but the thing is China and India are actually doing things. China has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060, I believe India by 2070, so they are already in the process of decarbonizing their economy. So that's number one. They are doing something. But the other thing is I liken it to lawn maintenance. Just because you have a neighbor down the street who isn't taking care of their lawn, that doesn't mean that you should just give up taking care of your own lawn. You should probably take care of your lawn. That's number one. But number two, if you're taking care of your lawn and the other neighbors are taking care of their lawn, it becomes easier to put pressure on those who aren't taking care of their lawn. So that's number one. But beyond lawn maintenance, I think that we should be doing things. And the things that we can do is, I think, number one, definitely looking more into renewable resources here in Alabama. Alabama gets about 12% of its power as a state from renewable resources, which is good. That's up over the last decade, so that's definitely a good trend. But this state and our location, we're blessed with opportunities for so many different renewable resources, whether it's hydroelectric power up in the northern part of the state, or it's solar and wind down here. I mean, we're not going to run out of the sun anytime soon, Eric. So might as well take advantage of it. So that's one big thing that we can do. And another thing is that the state of Alabama, on a household-to-household basis, we're number 3 in the country in terms of energy usage, like one house to the next one. And that's because, and I'm guilty of it myself, during summer, blasting the AC, and during winter, blasting the heat. That's just what the climate is here. Well, one thing that we could do to help kind of alleviate that is to get our houses to be more energy efficient, whether it means more energy efficient appliances, energy efficient heating and cooling units, lighter colored roofs. I mean, there's a menu of options that you could do there. And not
Dr.
only does
Schultz,
that...
and on that one, sadly, we've got to end on that point there, but we will continue this discussion, though, at another time, because so helpful, and of course, giving folks more information on what to do to make a difference here on the Gulf Coast.
Well, I really appreciate you having me.
Dr. Steven Schultz, we thank you so much for sharing with us this morning.
Thank you, Eric.
Joining us now on Perspectives this morning, Dr. Kenneth Heck. He is Emeritus Faculty, but Senior Marine Scientist at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, as well as Professor, University of South Alabama. Thank you so much for being a part of our conversation this morning.
Good to be with you, Eric.
Well, we were talking about climate change, and I think I mentioned to you that one of the things that happened to me, I was sort of pulled into understanding that we all have a role in making a difference as it relates to the climate. And so how much change are we seeing? How much of what we're hearing from our scientific community should we be listening to? Because there are some visible changes that we are going through.
Yeah. Yes, and I study plants and animals that live in our coastal waters, and over the last 10 or 15 years, we have definitely seen some changes that reflect some of the more tropical species moving into our area and becoming established. And in the past, a lot of these tropical species would make it to our area, but they would die out in the wintertime because we're too cold for them. And what's been happening in the last decade or two is that our winters just haven't been quite as cold. And so some of these tropical species that have moved into our area now are surviving throughout the winter and becoming mature and actually reproducing here as well.
When you talk about those temperatures, is it a consistent period of the cold weather, or just we aren't hitting those temperatures anymore that we once did?
Yeah, it's really the sort of the minimum temperatures that are the problem. I mean, we can have 1 or 2 cold nights that will be too much for some of these species, and it will knock them out, and they won't return maybe for a couple of years. But those really cold nights are happening less frequently now than they did, say, 30, 40 years ago. So that's kind of the difference. And by the time an organism moves into our area, let's say a tropical fish, like a snapper species, moves into our area as a juvenile, by the time it survives for a couple of years, it's more tolerant of cold temperatures there. So it's kind of, escaped once it's made it through that sort of vulnerable juvenile stage.
It's interesting you mentioned the snapper, because I guess maybe a year or so ago, they were looking at the numbers and they were very surprised that there were a lot more snapper than I think the government was counting, and just overwhelmed with how healthy a population we did have here in this area.
Yeah, and some of these tropical snappers they're not the red snapper, the one that's really so common in our area and that supports such a huge fishery. Some of these tropical snappers are moving into our area. Things like the gray or mangrove snapper, the lane snapper, they're becoming more abundant. And one question is, how will they interact with the native species of red snapper, for example? I actually had a student who looked at some of these interactions, and thus far we don't see anything that we ought to worry about. The tropical ones just seem to be fitting in. They're not causing a loss of the existing red snappers, and they seem to be here and just increasing in abundance, and more people are catching them now than they used to.
My goodness. Talk about some of the other sea life that we're seeing who are moving to this area. Are the manatees another group that we're seeing more of now?
Yes, manatees and green turtles are other species that have really benefited from conservation efforts, but also because of the warmer temperatures, they've expanded their range, let's say from South Florida into North Florida and even into our part of the Gulf of Mexico here. So those species have benefited both from conservation efforts and from the changing temperature that we've got.
Now, when you talk about the changes in the ecology of the coastal waters, break that down for us for layman terms.
Yeah, so one of the things about the Gulf of Mexico that is somewhat unique is that the existing species, let's say of fishes or crabs or shrimps or any of the things you can think of that exist here, really don't have anywhere to go as the temperature changes. And this is different than on the Atlantic or the Pacific coast, where as the temperature changes, the waters become warmer, those species that prefer cooler water can just move north toward the polar regions. Well, here in the Gulf of Mexico, they really can't do that. They're restricted by the land that's here. So these species that are moving up from the south, these tropical species, and the ones that exist here naturally are having to interact with one another now. So it's kind of a unique situation. And one possibility is that we're going to wind up with kind of a novel assemblage of species. One that includes both the temperate species, the ones that we're used to here, as well as some of these tropical animals and plants that are moving in. There's certainly plants as well as animals that are moving in our direction.
Any concerns about the type of plants that are moving here? I know we've had some problems in the past with certain species that really mass produce and can cause problems in the waterways. Any that you are concerned about as you're observing this?
Yeah, I mean, right now, the biggest change that we can see is the mangroves trees that are moving into the coastal zone, and they have the ability to replace our emergent salt marshes. So that's one thing that people can see. The mangroves are trees that live in the coastal zone in the tropics. They're moving up the Gulf of Mexico, both from the west and the east, and they're kind of coming together in the middle of this area. So that's one thing that people can see. They start seeing trees growing right near the water's edge, and this would be the salt water's edge, whereas we'd seen the marsh plants in the past. So the mangroves are different. And they harbor different kinds of animals than the salt marshes do. So that's one thing, not necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely a change. And one of the things that mangroves do is grow a little higher up toward the land than our salt marsh plants. So that means that there's less time for the little shrimps and crabs and fish that hide in the marsh to be out in the water when the mangroves move into the area. So the mangroves are just flooded less often, and therefore animals that live in there have got to come out and be vulnerable to things that would like to eat them.
Oh my goodness, just changes galore there. Take about a minute there, Dr. Heck, and tell us what can we do as ordinary citizens who want to do something about the climate change. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, people can do the things that sort of reduce their carbon footprint, but as far as the animals are concerned, there's really not a whole lot that we can do about that. This is something that's happening. It's happened in the past. Historically, when waters were warmer, these tropical species moved into our area. So there's really, it's not really a bad thing. These are species that live in the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. They're just now moving into the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico, and we're kind of just reassembling the groups of organisms that live here in the northern Gulf. So I don't think people need to worry about this. I mean, there's kind of nothing we can do about it anyway.
When you look at the time period, you're talking about the last 10, 20 years, what are you expecting to see here in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to continue. And here in the Northern Gulf, we've kind of had 2 steps forward and then 1 step back as we have a cold winter. It's just that those cold winters are occurring less frequently than they used to. So I see a continuation of the tropical species moving into our area. We're going to see our coastal marshes become mangrove forest. I think that's going to happen. We're going to see more tropical fishes, things that people interact with. They will see them. They'll start catching fish that they never caught before. One of the species that is showing up kind of sporadically now is the snook. Snook is a great game fish. It occurs in South Florida. It's now expanding its range into the northern Gulf. So there are going to be some additional fishery species that occur in our area that people are going to enjoy catching. So those are some of the things that are happening. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the changes are not just happening in the water. There are also changes that take place on land. Those are not things I study so much, but certainly we're going to have additional tropical insects move into our area, and that's happening already. Some of the mosquitoes,
yes,
those are things that I think the health people worry about, is some of these mosquitoes are vectors for diseases that we don't want to have in our area.
Right, we don't want that part at all. Dr. Kenneth Heck, we thank you so much for joining us this morning and discussing this aspect of the climatic changes, and of course very fascinating about our plant and animal species as well. Thank you so much for being our guest this morning.
Thank you, Eric.
Up next on Perspectives, 2 years into COVID, and some of us are still trying to understand the changing protocols. Florida health officials are opposing masks and now vaccinations for some children. In Mobile County, health department officials say that hopefully COVID is over. But because of the Mardi Gras season, the Gulf Coast is going to be the test tube for the rest of the nation in the next couple of weeks. So what protocol information do we use to go to indoor places, especially if you don't know everyone's vaccination status? Well, we talked to Dr. Randy Murphy to get a lot of answers to our questions of what do we do now. Well, we thank you for joining us here on Perspectives. Please join us again next Saturday morning as we discuss those important issues and seek solutions. I'm Eric Reynolds. Have a great week ahead.